I found out I'd been removed from the strategy meeting because my calendar invite arrived marked FYI. It landed in my inbox at 9:03. The meeting title was blunt, Regional Strategy Realignment. Below it, the list of attendees had been scrubbed of anyone who actually built the Q4 risk framework. My manager had shifted from collaboration to what he called simplified executive briefing. On the shared screen, a deck I had authored was being presented as his own victory. I noted the timestamp on the file properties. It had been duplicated and renamed at 8:45. My metadata was gone, replaced by his name as author. The presentation used the language of consensus the team aligned, we decided, but the operational reality was far more brittle. He was projecting a 22% efficiency gain in the EMEA logistics chain, while simultaneously freezing the contingency budget that made that gain possible. At a high level, it looked perfect. But if the clearance latency at the Rotterdam port hit even a 4-hour delay, the entire multi-region rollout would stall. If you've ever watched your work being used while your name disappeared, you already know how this part feels. The system hadn't reacted yet. I sat at my desk, watching the recording icon blink. I didn't interrupt. I simply opened my local log and recorded the 9 hours and 15 seconds system state. The architecture of the decision was now officially separated from the person who understood its breaking point. Work in this organization is like a liquid. It fills the space it's given until someone decides to bottle it and put their own label on the glass. I had submitted the final risk-adjusted roadmap privately on Friday afternoon. It was a 40-page technical deep dive into fiscal vulnerabilities and automated triggers. By Monday morning, those 40 pages had been compressed into 5 high-level executive themes. Ownership was reassigned silently. I watched the notification feed on the sidebar. Access level changed to read only by leadership. The system records reflected the shift with cold, procedural indifference. My permissions were downgraded from editor to resource, a move that technically removed my ability to flag errors in the live version. There was no conversation, no performance review. It was a clean, administrative deletion of my presence. Instead of arguing, I performed a mental scan of the new version. He had removed the complexity warning tags because, as he often said, we needed to stay at a high level. He wanted the prestige of the strategy without the weight of the constraints. I watched the stakeholders in the meeting chat offer digital applause. They weren't cheering for the logic. They were cheering for the absence of friction. I remained in the read-only file, the only person who knew that the simplified path led directly into a blind corner. If I had spoken up, I would have been correcting a superior on his own stage. In a culture that values the appearance of alignment over structural integrity, that is a career-ending move. Speaking up wouldn't have saved the project. It would have simply rebranded me as a procedural bottleneck. The risk of organizational scale was too high to play the martyr. We were dealing with a $600 million operational shift affecting 14 regional hubs. One voice screaming wait against a chorus of move faster is just silenced. So I stayed quiet. It wasn't an act of cowardice. It was an act of observation. I knew that my manager's assurance was polished. He cuts people off with a smooth, "We'll take that offline," whenever the questions get too specific. He sounded like someone used to being believed. He had traded my technical roadmap for his senior oversight, convinced that the board's comfort was more valuable than the system's accuracy. I closed the meeting window and went back to my notes. I updated version numbers and documented the exact timestamps of the presentation, not defensively, but as a matter of archival truth. The system was now moving at the speed of his confidence, but it had lost the traction of the data. I knew the first question would come within 6 hours. I just didn't know who would ask it first. The first question missed him entirely. It arrived at 14:12 in a private message from the head of global fulfillment. I might be overthinking this, it read, but can you look at scenario C? The assumptions behind the port latency buffer seem thin. I knew the answer immediately. I had spent 18 months making quiet corrections and adjusting forecasts before they reached this level of exposure. The stakeholder had noticed the gap my manager had simplified out of existence. I didn't claim credit for the original model. I didn't mention my exclusion. I responded clinically, Scenario C assumes a baseline latency of 2.1 hours. If that crosses the 4-hour threshold, after that, nothing could move without waiting. I offered the truth without claiming ownership of the plan. I provided the coordinate without explaining why the map in the manager's hand was missing the landmark. The fulfillment lead didn't reply for several minutes. He was likely cross-referencing my answer against the clean and conservative slide he had just seen. He didn't ask why the manager hadn't mentioned the 4-hour threshold. He just thanked me and went offline. It was a signal. The official channel was providing polished assurance, but the operational floor was already looking for a map that actually worked. Authority was leaking. By the following morning, the side messages began to multiply. It was a pattern of quiet inquiries from different roles and regions, all bypassing the formal briefing. A finance lead in LATAM messaged me about the tax trigger logic. A strategy lead in EMEA asked if my 2025 model for labor shifts was still active. I answered each of them the same way, with precision, without emotion, and without a single word of public contradiction. I watched the leadership dashboard remain static while my private terminal became a hub of unrecorded activity. The answers were moving sideways, flowing through the informal wiring of the organization, while the manager's confidence remained loud and repetitive. In the official syncs, he continued to repeat the same assurances. He'd start every sentence with net to signal a conclusion he hadn't actually earned. The room didn't challenge him. The prestige of his title still carried weight, but no one was building on what he said either. The conversation would end, and then my inbox would light up with waiting, queued, and pending status checks. They weren't asking him for clarification because they had realized his answers were hollow. They were asking me because they needed to know if the bridge was safe to cross. The system was entering a state of unacknowledged paralysis. Everyone was nodding in the light, but checking their notes in the dark. The friction was subtle at first. Decisions that usually took 24 hours began to stretch into 3 days. "Let's circle back" became the dominant phrase in every executive thread. No one used the word delay, but that was the reality. By this point, the timeline hadn't broken yet, but there was no longer enough time left to fix it quietly. One director in London adjusted her headset twice during a call, her eyes scanning the variance chart. My manager doubled down on the optics, treating downward volatility as timing noise. Whenever anyone pressed him for details, he'd smile and say, "We'll take that offline." I watched as a quiet, clarifying artifact began spreading. A PDF checklist I had authored a year ago was being used to validate the manager's new strategy. No one said anything publicly. No credit was given, but the work was finding its way back to the center. The manager instituted more checkpoints and more controls, his voice getting louder as the answers got shorter. He was trying to manage the optics of a plan that was losing its structural integrity. An internal checklist finally flagged a dependency that hadn't been revalidated since I was removed. It wasn't a loud alert, just a quiet yellow marker on the project management software. But in a high-scale operation, a yellow marker is a scream that hasn't found its voice yet. In one Tuesday afternoon meeting, a director started to say, "Maybe we should ask," and then he stopped. He looked at the manager's polished face. Then he looked at the participant list where my name was buried in the optional section. He corrected himself mid-sentence. "Let's validate the assumptions first." Everyone in the room knew what he meant. The silence that followed was loaded with the recognition that functional knowledge had migrated. I sat there, my microphone muted, feeling a brief, sharp sense of personal risk. If I spoke now, I would expose the manager's ignorance and my own parallel authority. I stayed silent. I internally doubted my own restraint, wondering if the organizational scale demanded a louder intervention. True authority is like gravity. You don't notice it until you try to walk on air. The system was already correcting itself. You could feel the collective recalibration. They weren't looking at the manager for the next set of instructions. They were looking for a way to verify his words without offending his ego. I wasn't competing for authority. Authority was simply consolidating around the person who wasn't guessing. The meeting adjourned without a decision, but with a very clear understanding of where the answers actually lived. Smaller meetings began to emerge without the manager's knowledge. Drafts of regional implementation plans started landing in my inbox for a quick look. Nothing was documented, nothing was official, but the progress of the entire Q4 realignment was now waiting on my terminal. Approvals paused without explanation. If I didn't reply to a sanity check ping, the regional lead wouldn't move. The simplified decision flow was now entirely dependent on the person it had excluded. The system language began to dominate the human narrative. Words like blocked, unresolved, and pending verification started appearing in the manager's own status reports. To maintain operational continuity, he began blaming market volatility and vendor lag, unaware that his own team was routing around him. The work had found its way back to me because the organization values survival over the org chart. He was still cutting the ribbon on the presentation, but the bridge was only standing because I was privately reinforcing the pylons. The dependency was now absolute, even if it was invisible to the executive floor. He would say net to end a meeting, and the team would immediately open a private channel to ask me what the real bottom line was. The formalization came not as a promotion, but as a procedural change. A senior leader stopped by my desk at 1600 hours on a Thursday. No CC, no subject line. "Can you walk me through how we got here?" he asked. He was pointing to a discrepancy in the Rotterdam latency logs that my manager had dismissed as an outlier. I didn't offer a dramatic reveal. I didn't blame the manager. I simply pulled up my 2026 risk log and walked him through the assumptions, the timelines, and the decision points. Calmly, precisely, I showed him the logic that had been stripped from the briefing. No announcement was made. No one was fired. But on Friday morning, an administrative update went out. All strategy realignment outputs now require technical validation by the risk oversight terminal. That terminal was mine. To ensure proper governance controls, the system now required a secondary check for every major milestone. The prestige remained with the manager. He kept the title, the office, and the public-facing role, but the real power had been permanently codified into the verification layer. The org chart stayed the same, but the wiring was entirely different. The system had learned that it couldn't survive on polished assurance alone. It now demanded accuracy, and it had built a gate that only I could open. He kept the role. He lost the ability to move anything forward. In the next executive sync, my manager attempted to pivot the strategy again. He spoke with the same polished confidence he had on day one. But this time, when he finished, the room didn't clap. They didn't even nod. They all looked at their monitors, waiting for the validation flag on the shared dashboard to change from amber to green. His requests were no longer approvals. They were suggestions awaiting validation. He had been structurally diminished to a narrator. He was reading the updates that the system required me to verify. He still held the title of process owner, but his signature was stripped of its power. He couldn't commit to a timeline or a budget without my terminal sending the digital handshake. The explicit loss was the loss of agency. He was now performing leadership for an audience that was only interested in the data. He would clear his throat, adjust his tie, and say, "At a high level, we're on track," only to have a senior leader ask, "Does the risk terminal confirm that variance?" The confidence was still there, but it carried no gravity. The high-stakes test came when a sudden shift in the Asian markets triggered a margin call on our logistics contracts. To protect enterprise risk, the manager tried to react instinctively, calling for an immediate release of contingency funds. He sent the order at 10:15. The system didn't move. The transaction sat in the queue, marked pending technical verification. The manager called an urgent meeting, talking longer and faster than usual, trying to force the decision through sheer volume. Net, he shouted. "We need to move now." The room waited. Everything waited. The executive floor didn't call him for an explanation. They called the risk terminal. I spent 20 minutes walking through the cascading impact of an early fund release on our long-term stability. I verified the safer alternative. Only then did I hit the key. The system proceeded. The margin call was resolved, and the project moved forward, but not on his command. Verification had become the bottleneck, and I was the only person with the key. The manager sat in the corner of the boardroom, his microphone active but silent. He had lost the ability to gamble with the company's revenue. Whenever he tried to say, "We'll take that offline," the CEO would look at me and ask for the online answer. There was no announcement when I was added back to the formal discussion. No explanation was given for why my permissions were restored to executive editor. By then, the role had already been reassigned, not by title, but by behavior. The manager still speaks first in every meeting. He still uses "we" when talking to the partners, but no one looks at him when the questions get difficult. They look at the terminal. I walk through the assumptions, the timelines, and the decision points. I provide the certainty that the system requires. The role has been permanently split. He handles the performance, and I handle the outcome. The organization didn't choose a side. It chose survival. The questions stopped reaching him because the room realized he was just the narrator of a story he didn't write. The work is no longer disappearing. It is being verified. I hit the final key on the Q4 reconciliation. The progress bar hits 100%. The validation chime sounds across 14 regional hubs. Approval state, finalized.